Thank you, Amy, and thanks everyone for joining today. As Amy mentioned, the focus of today's presentation is going to be a crash course in UX designed for SAP developers. Just a little kind of background on myself. This is an area that I'm particularly passionate about because in SAP I started my career in the development space. And as technologies like Fiori came out, and we got more involved in actually creating the user interfaces, it became pretty clear to me that, being a good developer wasn't enough to make the applications, really great for our end users. And that we also kind of had to add in this UX, this experience part of it, to not just make applications, but to make really useful applications, really powerful applications for our end users. So, I really enjoy this UX space. I think it's a really powerful skill for developers to add to their toolbox, in terms of really rounding out your ability to create, like I said, not just applications, but really good, really powerful, really impactful applications. So hopefully this presentation, it's just an hour, so you won't necessarily leave as an expert in UX, but hopefully it gives you a good introduction to some of the different areas that are involved in creating quality experiences. We'll pass on some extra learning materials, and then certainly give you guys time for question and answer, as well as my contact information. I'm always happy to answer any other questions you may have offline or share any tricks and tips. So looking forward to this presentation. So there's some of the things that we're going to cover today, and it's a lot. So be a lot of information coming at you pretty quickly. First, we just want to cover really what is UX, what is user experience, what do we kind of mean when we say that. We'll go into some of the different areas that are involved in creating a quality experience, like performing user research, like prototyping applications. We will go into a really important tool that hopefully people become, or either already very familiar with or become familiar with, which is the Fiori Design Guidelines. We'll touch on how we can apply those to our applications through something called heuristic evaluations. Quickly, we'll touch on Agile and Fiori. So how do Agile development practices really help us stay focused on providing a quality experience? And then lastly, like I mentioned, we'll touch on some extra resources, some books, some courses, some conferences that I've personally read or taken or been to that I think were really valuable for me, and that you can certainly look into doing that as well as a way to continue to expand your UX learning. So really, what is user experience? So we have a couple different definitions here. The Oxford Dictionary basically states it as the overall experience of a person using a product such as a website or computer application, especially in terms of how easy or pleasing it is to use. Actually, UX really extends even past the software world and into other physical products as well. Coffee pots have a UX, and your dishwasher has a UX, and all those different things. So it's really, people using any sort of website, app, product. And the Nielsen-Norman group expands out a little further and mentions it encompasses all aspects of an end user's interactions with a company, its services, and its products. So, they're kind of saying it's really not just even, if I take a company like Nordstrom, it's shopping in their store, it's shopping on their app, it's calling customer service, it's how quickly deliveries get to me and are they accurate. It's all of those different things. But one thing worth highlighting here, especially for developers, is as a developer, you will likely work on the UI, the user interface. So that's the physical thing, the application that you would build that users interact with. The UX, the user experience, is basically how they feel about using that app, whether they enjoy it, whether it's easy, whether it's frustrating, difficult. All of that contributes to the user experience. So developers, as developers, we build UIs. For our end users, those UIs have user experiences. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So what kind of UX professions exist? And I put this up here really to highlight, I think, a key point in that a lot of people think that UX is prototyping. It's visual design, it's art. And you'll see here, we do have visual design, we have interaction design. So certainly people that are designing the applications, people that are able to create high fidelity prototypes and layer in the coloring and the branding and all those different aspects is a very important a very important part of UX design, but it's not the only thing that's out there. So if maybe that's not your strong suit, there are still definitely other ways that you can contribute to providing a quality user experience. We have information architects. These are people that are focusing on how the data really behind the applications are organized. Is it structured in a way that makes sense to users? Are we using the right groupings? If we also tie in copywriting, which is using the right text, are we using the right labels? One thing we see in SAP often is that there's a disconnect between what SAP calls a particular field and how real people talk about it in the real world. So making sure that we pick up how users are actually using that information, how they talk about it, is important. So there's really a lot of different parts to user experience. So if visual design isn't your thing, you may be really great at helping figuring out the right text or the right data. And certainly too, you can also work on those prototyping skills, and we'll talk about that a little later. But overall, just want to give you a sense for all of the different things and all the different parts that contribute to providing a quality experience. So one of the first things is user research. And I think this goes beyond, this is a little bit like requirements gathering that you might have done on traditional products, but it takes it a step further in terms of, we don't just want to know what the user needs to do, because we do need to know that. Certainly we need to be able to make sure that whatever we're building completes their core functions and they're able to get their job done. But user research really helps us figure out maybe what challenges they're having, or what different ways they'd like to be able to do something, or sometimes too it's finding out what they really like about particular processes, so we can highlight that part and then address some of their challenges. But the main point is we really need to be performing user research if we want to be able to provide a quality user experience. So we need to get to know who we're building our applications for and what their specific needs are, so that we can address them in future solutions. I think another great thing that user research does is it really brings the users to the table. It gives them a voice in co-creating their next products. And in terms of projects, that really helps on the change management side, because a lot of times what we see is users hear about a project, someone asks them some questions, and then like 6 months, 8 months, a year later, they get called in to do UAT on this new thing that they've never seen before. And it can be kind of jarring. So user research and bringing them along in the development process, I think, is a good way to initiate that change management and to make sure that their voice is heard and that they kind of have an expectation about what they'll be getting. And really what this helps us do is not create the same app in a different tool. So in the SAP world, right, we're seeing a lot of things going from SAP GUI to something like a Fiori application. And if we just take the same screen and make a bunch of Fiori elements and release that, we do have a new app, it's on the web, great. But it really didn't improve the experience much, because we didn't get to understand what was and was not working about the previous GUI app. We just kind of ended up building that into Fiori. So this user research piece lets us really figure out not only what we should be developing, but how we should go about that to make sure that the next tool that we create and all this effort we put in and all this code we generate is something that provides value to our users and to our business. So there's a number of different tools that exist out there. Surveys are probably the easiest. You can use something like SurveyMonkey or Google Forms, or I think Microsoft has one that might be called Forms too, but they package that with some of their Office suite as well. But a lot of tools out there to let you put in some questions, put in an email or distribution list, and get that out to users right away. So it's really great at collecting information from a lot of users without having to spend a ton of time doing research. So this is something that if you don't have a big user research team, which in the SAP world is pretty likely that you don't, this is a good way that maybe you as the developer could help, say, hey, why don't we send this survey out ahead of time, and we'll collect some great information, and it really won't even take that much effort. The surveys are great for that. Interviews are kind of the next level of user research where we actually get to have a conversation with our users. So this is where we'll sit down face to face or over Skype, and we'll actually have a conversation. And this is really good because, you know, in surveys, you tend to only be able to get so much of an answer, right? People aren't going to type out an essay for every question that you have, and they shouldn't have to, because that'll make surveys quite difficult. So while our surveys are great at collecting a lot of information, you know, and some basic data points, interviews really layer that with the actual experience. So they get people to tell stories, they get people to share experiences, good and bad, and that'll give you a lot of information, great insights that you can take into building your next applications. The only caveat with user interviews is, you know, they tend to be half an hour or an hour, you know, so they are going to take longer for you to do. It's going to take you longer to reach more people. So they're not quite as scalable as surveys. So really good for getting deep levels of information, not as great at capturing information from a ton of people unless you have a big research team. The next one we have available to us is observations. These are something that we really put a focus on. You know, a lot of times what it amounts to is kind of like job shadowing, where we want to go out and we want to know what users are doing in their environment, how that's working. And it gives us a lot of good insights that sometimes don't even come up in interviews, because we get to see things as opposed to having people explain them. So sometimes those things that the users don't yet know how to articulate or ask for, observations are great at letting us see that firsthand and applying that to our, you know, whatever it is that we're going to create next. And lastly, we have usability studies. Not going to go too deep into that, but they're, you know, essentially a special kind of survey that lets us actually start putting metrics around our user experience. So we can basically send out surveys that capture how satisfied people are with their systems, how easy they are to use, how easy they are to learn, and we can start measuring that experience. And then hopefully it gives us a baseline for as we create new applications, we can track our impact. So based on some of those tools that we just talked about, you know, wanted to give some tips on creating effective surveys. So one of the main things you want to do is make your questions count. So I don't know if anyone's ever gotten a survey from, you know, a particular company and you've gone to take it. For me, that would be Delta Airlines. They always send out a survey, and anytime I've gone to try and take it, if I just want to leave one comment or one thing, it always turns into some 20-minute exercise that I quit out of within a minute because I'm not going to take that time. So we want to be really careful about how many questions we're asking our users and what level of effort we're asking them to put in, you know, because we want to be cognizant of their time and respectful of that. Avoid yes/no questions. So yes/no questions typically aren't going to get us a lot of information. So if you just say, do you enjoy your current applications? Yes and no. That's not going to give you a whole lot. But if you allow people to answer on something more like a scale from very dissatisfied to very satisfied, and maybe you track that across a number of different applications, it'll be much easier to see where the real pain points lie and where things might be okay or really good. So you'll get more information by giving people scales or by giving them the ability to make comments than just asking yes/no questions, which aren't very valuable. And lastly, I think this is important, test it with a colleague or maybe even someone you know that they might be actually completing that survey. You know, see if you can take a minute of their time and get them to review it and just make sure that it makes sense to them. Make sure that the questions are worded in a way that people know how to answer. And especially if, you know, it's a functional area that you're not used to, they can really help make sure that you're using the right language and that it's going to make sense to the users that you're talking to. So definitely a good idea to do a quick 10, 15-minute test before sending it out and making sure that, you know, it's really going to be effective for you. In addition to surveying, I think, you know, interviews might be something that you can add into your next project as well. So I wanted to give a few tips on creating those. I think the key, and I think a lot of people don't always think about this when they do interviews if they're not used to it, but a really great practice is to create an interview script. We want to make sure that we're asking the users the same questions so that we're getting the same information. We want to make sure that we plan out what data it is we're trying to get. So similar with surveys, where you don't want to be asking a lot of useless questions, in interviews too, we really want to plan out what we're going to be capturing so that we make our time effective. There's a couple different areas that are important to interview scripts. And the first is an introduction. So just make sure that you introduce the user to the project, why they're there, maybe what the goals of the project are, just so they have a little context, and starts getting them in the right frame of mind, and it starts opening up that conversation between the two of you, especially if you don't know each other very well. It's just something to get them involved, get them in the right headspace. Then we can connect some additional data points. So something like background questions about the user. Things I see come up often in like the SAP world might be, how many years of experience do you have in this role? That's helpful because we might want to compare our answers between someone that has 10 years and someone that has 10 weeks experience, and see if they're the same or if they really have different needs. We also might ask how often people perform certain transactions, how many purchase orders they create. Something like that gives us a good kind of baseline in the background questions that we can use to kind of compare and contrast against different users and how they answered some of the main questions. Which brings us to those main questions. So again, we want to be really thoughtful about what data it is that we're capturing. We want to be thoughtful of both the user's time and our time because we're all very busy. So we want to make sure that we're getting the right information. And usually we try and do that with about 10 to 12 main questions. And what we try and do with those questions, again, it's the same with surveys, right? We don't want yes/no questions. We don't want leading questions. We want questions that get people to tell us stories or about the experience that they have. So tell me about the last time you had to do month-end close for your company. That'll probably get you some information on what their experience was, what challenges they may have had. Maybe it went really smoothly and they're like, hey, it went really perfect because the team did this. It really gets them talking about experiences, not just, did you have fun doing month-end close last month? Probably no. And if you just leave it at that, right, you're not really getting great information. So use these main questions to get people to tell you about their experiences and tell some stories. And then lastly, conclude their interview by thanking them for their time and making sure they covered what they wanted to say. So, first thank them and then just give them a chance. Was there anything else you wanted to say about this process or ideas you might have, and see if they have anything else before you end the interview. But creating these scripts, maybe testing these out with a colleague as well, but making sure that you have a plan for your interviews will maximize your time with your end users to make sure you're not wasting their time and that they feel like it's valuable and that you're not wasting your own time, right? Anyone is very busy, developers, project managers, BAs, everyone has a lot to do all the time. So we really want to make sure we're maximizing our time with these research methods. Once we've conducted all of this research, it can help if we put it in a way that makes sense to people, that we can share it out with our project team or maybe project stakeholders and say, we spent a week doing all this research, here's a condensed version of what we see. And one of those ways that we capture user research often is through something called a persona. And this is something that we use, and you'll see here the sections, we have a name and a role. If we can, from interviews or observations, we'll try and capture quotes. So real things people are telling us that highlight areas of their experience or give us insights into what their needs might be. We'll also capture devices and tools, things they're using to complete their job. Environmental context can become very important when we're in manufacturing environments, when it's potentially loud, when people are doing field service and they're out on the road. We've been in cold environments where people are wearing gloves often. So that's definitely something you have to think about if we're going to be giving them touchscreen devices, is how they'll work with gloves. So definitely environmental factors we want to pay attention to. And then really goals and pain points. So what are the user's main goals? What are their jobs to be done? What is it that they're trying to do? And what are their pain points? So what are some of those things that are holding them back from meeting those goals, or making it take 2 hours and really it should take 10 minutes? Um, and making sure that we focus on those goals, that we're helping them achieve them, and focusing on those pain points, and that we are hopefully removing them with our new applications. We'll make sure that, again, we're not just creating the same, GUI transaction with a Fiori app, but we're actually making a meaningful difference. And personas make sure that we kind of keep that frame of mind, and that we keep the user top focus and their needs top focus as we begin our development. So next we want to talk a little bit about prototyping. And this is an area that is really important as we talk about developing user interfaces, because there's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of ways to skin the cat, you could say. If you gave 10 different developers a list of requirements and said, build an app that lets me do these things, you might get back 10 different apps. So there's a lot of ways you can go about it. But what prototyping does is it allows us to really sketch that out before having to get into development, and test our designs with our end users, and make sure that we're on the right track, that we're building something that's going to be effective and useful, and that we're not doing that thing, like we mentioned earlier, where we wait 6 months and unveil this new tool they've never seen and just really hope that they like it. So prototyping is a great way that we can start validating what our interface is going to look like, and make sure that's going to work for our end users. It also becomes a really important artifact for developers, because you want to know what you're supposed to build. If you just have a loose set of requirements and go about creating an interface, you really open yourself up to having to do a lot of rework, which as a developer is really frustrating, and time consuming, and you don't want to have to do that. So prototyping is super effective for everyone on the project, really. The users will know what they're getting, you'll get buy-in, you'll make sure that you're building something useful. The developers will have a great spec that they can build off of. It'll be great for project managers because you can estimate the effort. So prototyping is a really important part of providing a quality experience as we're building these interfaces. So different prototyping tools that are available to us. The most basic is going to be something like pen and paper, or a whiteboard and a marker. And as low fidelity, as kind of rough as these tools are, they're still surprisingly effective in communicating the value of design and what it is that we want to create. So don't necessarily have to have a fancy set of tools or a background using the Adobe Creative Suite. You can really even do a lot just with something like pen and paper. The next kind of level of prototyping that we have would be called wireframing. This is where you're creating something that, it's usually with a computer product. They still tend to look like a sketch. A lot of times they're still in black and white. We're not necessarily thinking about all the colors and all that stuff yet, but it lets us lay the screen out in a way that people get a sense for what it might look like. We'll see what data elements are on the screen. And a lot of times these tools give us the ability to add interaction to them as well. So users can see if they click this button, maybe they'll get a pop-up message or a confirmation dialog, or, if they hit the next button, they'll go to the next part of the process, the next screen. So they help add in some of that interaction piece. It'll help make it more real for users. Lastly, we have these high fidelity mockups. So, and at Mindset, we use a tool called Sketch. Other people use something like Adobe XD. There's something called Figma that's becoming very popular, but these are definitely their computer tools. They can be very complex. There's a lot to do there. You can set all sorts of colors and typography and make them gradients and do a whole lot. They can really show exactly what the application should look like. A lot of times they get annotated with the styles like the CSS or different things that the developers might have to add. So these are really great at showing exactly what things can look like. These are also tools that tend to be more expensive and a little bit harder to learn. So just something to consider when, if you want to go out and create a prototype, you can certainly start with pen and paper. If you're new to it, even a wireframe tool might be great. And if you really want to make that next jump, it could be worth looking into some of those high fidelity tools. So some of those, examples of tools that can meet these prototyping needs. This would be an example of a wireframing tool, very popular. It's called Balsamiq. And the outputs are basically something like you see on the right. They have different templates you can use to kind of create the frame for a web page or something on an iPhone or a tablet. And then you can start to add the screen elements that you see. So you can add some text, you can add checkboxes and different buttons. And it's very drag and drop and fairly simple to use, but it lets you start laying out the screen, it lets you show the users, okay, what data elements will be there, how will I enter new data, where are the buttons and what do they do. So if you're new to prototyping but want to go past pen and paper, Balsamiq is a really great tool that you could use for that purpose. We talked a little bit about Sketch. This is one of those high fidelity tools. If you're new to prototyping, completely new, I'd maybe stay away from this one for now. But something you could definitely layer in as you get more experience with visual design and want to learn that next level of tool. And here again, we can create, pixel perfect versions of what it is you eventually want to create. Be really precise about our sizing and our layout and our spacing and our typography and colors and all of those things that ultimately can contribute to a good user experience. And another tool that we use to help make that interactive is called Envision. So within Sketch, we usually upload those screens to a tool called Envision. This is a cloud-based tool that you can use to, you basically, as you'll see here, we've created a hotspot on one of the buttons there, and we tell it that when a user clicks that, it'll take them to this other screen, and you can set some other properties, but it helps us add interaction to our prototypes. And it also gives us an area to capture feedback. So what we really like about Envision is when we send this link out to people, to our end users, they can fill out comments. We can, start a conversation around, version 1, we're never going to get it completely right. So this allows us to have that conversation that we iterate on that design so that we are, moving towards that end goal of creating an impactful solution. So especially since this presentation is kind of tailored towards SAP designers and developers, you have to talk about the Fiori design guidelines. So I think, as most people know, Fiori is the user experience that SAP is focused on for the future. Across most of their products, they're looking to layer in that Fiori experience. S/4HANA is already an all Fiori experience, and they're even adding that into some of their other cloud tools as well. We'll see here too that it's not just for the Fiori Launchpad. They've added it for native apps like Android and iOS. And really what these design guidelines will do is provide you all of the information you need to know about, how should the screens be laid out, what floor plans are available to you to help with that, what UI controls are there. So we'll dig a little bit more into that. So if you go to the Fiori design guidelines and you kind of get into the Explore area, you'll see that from there you can select any of the controls available in Fiori, as well as some of the different page layouts. And they have all sorts of really great information in there. So as you start to build out Fiori applications, if that's something that you'll be doing, this is a really important place to go. So for this example, we have something like a combo box, which is like a drop down. And one of the things, they give us a quick intro, and they also give us a really great section on when you should use this and when you shouldn't. So if you have a particular use case and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the best control for me to use? All of these pages will have information on when you should use it and when not to. And then if you look at the when not to side, you'll also see that they usually propose an alternative. So not only will they help you figure out what's the right control to use, they'll, if maybe you selected initially the one that maybe isn't the right one, they'll help guide you to the right area. So really great, especially for new UI developers, new to the Fiori user experience. A lot of good information there. Under components and styles, they'll also tell you different ways that this can be implemented, the different aspects of the control itself. So you have an input field and a drop down and a list. You'll see in different styles, right at the bottom, we have a 2-column layout where it has a country and country code. That might come up often. We see a lot of times people are looking at a plant and a plant code, or a company and a company code. So this shows you that you can in fact have a 2-column layout in your combo box. So again, as you're looking for, what's the right use case? How do I implement this control? What are the different options? The Fiori design guidelines will do a good job of showing you what those options are. It'll also give you information on behavior and interaction. So in this case, it's telling you about features like autocomplete. It's telling you how users might be able to select it. They can choose an option. They can start typing. They can get suggestions, all those different things. But behavior and interaction will tell you, what should I expect this control to actually do? And what are maybe some of the different ways that users can interact with it? So sometimes we'll get questions, just like this. Hey, can I use a combo box just by starting to type? And we would know from this article here, yes, that's a perfectly valid way of using it. You can just start typing and then hit the enter key and you'll select a valid selection. So behavior and interaction will tell you, how that tool will actually work and ways that the users can interact with it. Then kind of the last, but maybe most important piece, or at least tied for most important, so the information is useful as well, but especially for our developer crowd. You've gone through this whole page, you've looked at combo boxes, you've seen the styles and the properties, and you're like, okay, this is the tool for me. I want to implement it, but I don't know how yet, because I'm new. So at the bottom there, we also have 2 really great tools that we can use. So you'll see the top one on the right side under implementation. We'll see SAP UI5 samples. So that's a link that'll take you to all sorts of sample code that SAP has to help you out on implementing, pretty much all of the different UIs. But this one, it links us directly to the UI element that we're looking at. So combo box. If it's a very simple control, they'll have one example. If it's a little bit more complex, like tables have 15 or 20 different sample code implementations based on all the different properties you can set and the different styles that exist. So, and when you go there too, you're also able to directly copy the code and see what they've written and import it into a project that you're working on. So you have a good baseline to go off. You'll probably have to tweak it a bit to make it fit your needs, but it's a really amazing resource, especially when you're first learning, or honestly, it's a lot to keep in your head, even as you get experience. So I know even experienced developers that often have the API reference and the samples page up. Speaking of the API reference, that's the other resource we see there under implementation. So the samples do a good job of showing you code snippets and different examples of the control. The API reference is like the whole manual on that control. So what properties does it have? How do we create it dynamically? What events can we attach to it? What methods exist? All of those different things. So once you want to get really deep into, okay, how do I use this control? The API reference has a manual out there on every single control. So tons of good information on the Fiori design guidelines, both from an experience perspective and making sure that we're selecting the right control, that we know how it's going to behave and how our users can interact with it. And then for developers, ultimately, how do we get that implemented? How do we find out more about that control? How do I make sure that I know the right way to add that into my project? So especially if this is a new tool for you, the Fiori design guidelines, if it's something you haven't spent a lot of time with, let this really be one of your key takeaways for today to go and explore that more. So I want to talk a little bit about heuristic evaluations. And at first it sounds kind of complex, but it's really not. Heuristics are basically just a collection of usability principles that represent best practices. So typically, and we see there's about 10 heuristics. We'll go over about 5 of them today that I see come up most often. But a heuristic is nothing more than a best practice and a lens that we can use to evaluate our application. So we take one of these principles, we get it top of our mind, we look through our application to make sure that we're applying, we're fitting that best practice, or maybe we can see that there's room to improve, and we can figure out, it's a good way of diagnosing potential things you might want to change about your application or do in the new version of the application so that you are providing this great experience. One that's very important, especially in SAP, is visibility of system status. When a user clicks something or wants, submits a purchase order or approves a contract, they need to be able to know what's happening, especially as they interact with, these business elements. So busy indicators let users know when a page or information is loading, so that they're aware that, when they hit the search button, that something's happening, and then SAP is retrieving that data for them, and it should be there in a second. Other things like messages, popovers, dialogues. On the right, you'll see an example of what's called a message toast, which is a message that kind of comes up and then fades away after a few seconds. All of those do a great job. Once you've clicked a button, once you've submitted or deleted or done something, we need to let the user know that that action has actually taken place. And especially, we need to let them know if anything and any error has occurred. So here, product was added to your cart, so they'll know that successfully that was added to their cart. Other times we'll see people submit things and it's, we have to send an error back, this doesn't work for your validity date or something like that. So we need to do a good job of communicating what's happening as our users interact with the screen. Match between the system and the real world. So this kind of comes back to something I mentioned a little bit earlier, especially around labeling and data, is, are we using the right language that makes sense to our users? Or are we requiring them to learn, a whole new dictionary of SAP speak when they get their job so that they can effectively talk about it? So, this is something that we see with, your seasoned SAP vets know all the tables and the exact ABAP field names and all those kind of things. New users coming in, they have to learn all of that brand new. It can be very difficult and daunting. So trying to, as we create these new applications, trying to make sure that the language we use, the labels, the groupings match how people actually talk about this, and it's kind of, use the vernacular, use plain English, however you kind of want to say that, and maybe sometimes avoid some of the SAP speak so that it's easier to learn for new users and that, it's easier for people to have a conversation about. Consistency and standards, super easy one to follow. One of the core principles of the Fiori design language is consistency. So if you get to know the Fiori design guidelines, if you understand how they're building applications, it should be no problem to make your apps consistent. And this way, if you have 10 different developers on your team working on 10 different apps, they might do different things. They'll certainly behave and interact differently, but they should all have the same look and feel. They should all match the Fiori design guidelines. It should even match what SAP is doing. There should be a consistency across your application so that users know if they see this button in 2 different apps, that it really should do the same thing. Or tables, they can interact with them in the same way. As long as you follow the Fiori design guidelines, you will keep your applications nice and consistent. Error prevention. So it's great through system status to give them meaningful error messages. It's even better if we can prevent errors from happening in the first place. And one of the best ways I see to do this in SAP applications and Fiori applications is data validation. So have them select from a valid list of data through something like a search help or what we call a value help dialog, or drop-down menus. Use validation in forms to make sure they've gotten the right information before they submit. Other examples are, for input fields, we can choose if it's a text or a number or a phone number. So again, just little things we can do to help people validate that they're putting in the right data, they're selecting valid data, they've entered it the right way. I think we see this a lot of times in forms we do online when we're checking out, address pre-population, just little helpful hints to make sure we're entering our credit card information the right way. We can apply some of those same things to SAP to make sure that people are able to select the right data, put in the right stuff, and really minimize the amount of time they have to submit and hit an error and make changes, because that back and forth is not fun. And it definitely slows people down. So any areas that we have to reduce the errors that people are making, catch them before they happen, help them fill it out, it's definitely going to be a productivity boost for our business, and it's definitely going to be an experience boost for our end users. And lastly, recognition over recall. So SAP has a lot of information. There's, even on this screen, right, we see there's a ton of fields, there's a ton of stuff going on. We want to make sure that as users navigate between screens, we use something like here, the header area would be used to keep some of that core information showing, so that if we get interrupted and have to come back, or if we just want to see certain values, we don't lose our context. We still know that if I click on other tabs, if I scroll down, I'm still looking at this particular laptop, and that's kind of front and center information. We don't want people to have to remember, all of this info, store it in their head as they move forward. That's going to make things difficult to use, or have to go back and forth. If they're entering information, again, that could cause errors. So we want to make sure that each screen has the right amount of information, so that users can understand what it is that they're looking at, and then they don't lose that context as they navigate around. So real quick, I want to talk a little bit about Agile and Fiori. So I don't know how many of you may be using Agile development practices within your organization. And my intention is not to go through an overview of Agile, but just to let you know that it is something that we see as effective, both for the development teams, as well as for providing, again, with that user experience lens, to provide quality experiences for end users. And so we know that this is not typical in a lot of SAP development practices. We know that you probably won't be doing Scrum for your S/4HANA migrations, but for the development of user interfaces for custom Fiori apps, for mobile apps, we have found that Agile is a really effective method for delivering those types of applications. So we usually have our Scrum team. So it's 5 to 7 people. These will include the Scrum Master, kind of like your project manager. They'll help make sure that everything's on the right track, and help make sure the team is following Agile best practices. Obviously, we have developers on our development team. You guys will be the ones creating the applications, actually building everything and understanding what features that you need to be adding. The product owner is usually someone from the business that makes the decision on what's highest priority, what's in scope, what's out of scope, those types of decisions. And hopefully we have someone that can contribute to the user experience, whether that's a designer, whether it's a developer that has taken the time to learn some UX best practices, like we're going through today. So you could be that voice as well. We usually have 2-week sprints, and I think these last 2 points are really why Agile contributes to a quality user experience. Is we are demoing often. So typically every 2 weeks, or at least once we have our initial build product done, we are trying to demo something to our users every 2 weeks. This is what's been completed. This is how it works. This is how the tool is going to be used. And then it gives them the opportunity to ask questions, to provide feedback, maybe to provide little course corrections along the way, to make sure that we're adhering to our goals of building a quality user experience and building impactful applications. So I think the idea of demoing early on often and getting user feedback and incorporating it as early as we can is why Agile is a really effective way for developing these types of applications. So I know that's been a lot, and hopefully you've gotten some good learnings out of the things we've talked about today. But what we want to close with is maybe after today, some other methods that you can use to continue this UX journey. I'd say between, I've been really focused in the UX area for about 5 or so, 6 years now, specifically around building SAP applications. So it takes a good amount of time and a lot of effort to continue to build this as a skill. So there's a lot of great resources out there. Books, kind of old school, but still a great way to learn. Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug is a really awesome book. I think they've done a second version of it. It kind of first started to come out around, the internet and the app age around, users don't want to have to think really hard about how to do things. They want things to be simple and easy and obvious. And that's a great book that goes over some of those core UX design principles that'll help you build great applications. The next two, Sprint and Designing for Growth, are really books about how we can run workshops and how we can use tools like personas or user research tools like surveys and interviews to make impactful applications. So Sprint is something that, primarily founded over at Google, and the design sprint methodology. If you Google design sprints, you'll find a great website on all their tools. And then Designing for Growth is another really great book around the design thinking methodology, how different companies have applied it, and a lot of really great tools and practical knowledge that you can use in future projects. I think most of these are $20 or under, or they might even be available at your local library. So books are still a really great way to get some more information. Courses. So this is primarily focused around SAP. So we have to talk about OpenSAP. Free content, free courses that you can take. You'll see a lot of great discussions on the discussion boards. You'll have assignments that you can do to kind of test your knowledge and making sure you're learning things. And they have all sorts of stuff on Fiori, on design-led development, on user testing. They even have one on sketching. So if you want to get better at prototyping, but you're a little unsure of how to sketch things out, that's a really great course they have. So definitely OpenSAP is an awesome resource for SAP-focused UX learning. If you want to get outside of the SAP space a little bit and some more general UX principles, Coursera is another online course site that has a ton of different things. They have interaction design, agile and design thinking. They have user research, a lot of great stuff. They tend to be from professors at universities like UC Irvine, University of Minnesota, I believe just released a UX course. They tend to be free. So if you want to see the videos, that's all free. If you want to actually complete the assignments and get feedback, there's a small fee. General Assembly is something going to be a little more expensive. I think usually a couple $1,000 probably. But this is something that gives you access to kind of live instructors, real one-on-one coaching. So another, potential method depending on your budget and the time you want to devote, but this will give you real interaction with UX professionals that can help give you critiques and give you feedback and continue to grow. So we've got everything here ranging from free to inexpensive to, a little more expensive, but there's a lot of options out there, depending on your budget and your time frame. And lastly, conferences. So one that I personally participated in and found really effective was the Nielsen Norman Group. They offer UX trainings all over the world. There tends to be several in the United States. I've seen London, I've seen Singapore, a couple other cities in different countries pop up. These kind of conferences each day focuses on a specific topic, 8 hours of really deep learning on that subject area. And then afterwards, you have the option to take an exam and ultimately get UX certified. But I thought the learning content was really great there, and it was another good opportunity to meet UX professionals and see what other people are doing. I went in there having done primarily SAP, but you see people working on all sorts of digital products and different things. So it's a really cool place to get, not only a lot of great learning, but a lot of great perspective across the industry. Google Sprint Conference. Like I said, Google has been, and some of their members have been really drivers of creating this design sprint methodology and running design workshops within their organizations. And they have their own conferences and meetups where they present these learnings. And I believe this conference is free to attend. You just got to kind of register early. And it's a bit of an application process. So one to maybe look out for. And then Sapphire, TechEd, ASUG events, pretty much all of these things where SAP groups are coming together to talk and to give presentations. You'll always hear good customer stories. SAP will be there to talk about the latest tools. So definitely if you're in the SAP space, user experience is a big topic now. So if you go to any of these ASUG chapters, Sapphire, Tech Ed, insider events, you'll probably get some opportunities to learn a little bit more about user experience. So really, what's next? So especially after talking about the learning section, I want people to recognize that, like any other skill, like learning UI5, like learning ABAP, like learning all those new development tools, UX design is a skill that requires, effort to learn and practice, and it's something that you can definitely build over time. UX design is a lot more than just prototyping. So even if you aren't, don't feel comfortable sketching things, or if you don't want to use, you're like, I don't really want to use this Adobe XD tool, that's too complicated, that's fine. You can probably find others in your organization that can. There's a lot of other things that you can do to help. Maybe look at implementing agile delivery practices. Maybe try using one of those user research methods before development to make sure that you have the right focus. So there's a lot of different ways to get involved in building a great experience. You just kind of have to pick one. And then, with that, especially in SAP, we don't see teams typically having a ton of UX specific professionals. So I think especially on the development team, being that you're the ones creating these interfaces, you have a big opportunity to be that user advocate within your team, to become that UX expert. So I'd really encourage, everyone to make sure that, as you think about developing applications, like I said, see if you can do some user research ahead of time. See if you can create a wireframe before you get to coding, and just be that advocate for providing a quality experience in your organization. And I think ultimately, developers that not only can create great code, but they can create great experiences, we see that as a really big skill and something that's really big in demand in the marketplace. So I think, you'll get a lot of job satisfaction, and you may get a lot of job offers in the process as well. So definitely a good tool to have in your toolbox as a developer. So with that, I just wanted, kind of been talking for a while, so wanted to open up the floor for any questions or comments people may have.
Yeah, great. Great presentation, Dan. We do have actually a couple questions for you that I caught in the Q&A box. First one, I'm not a good artist, so how can I help with UX design?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we kind of talked about, user experience, and, a lot of people think of it as art and they only think of it in the prototyping sense, but that's not the only thing that contributes to user experience. You can help conduct the research and make sure that we're focusing on the voice of the user. You can implement agile development practices so that you're demoing and getting learnings from the user as you build. And then I think too, prototyping isn't about art as much as it's about building useful interfaces. So I think it's even a skill. I'm by no means an artist, but over time I think I've gotten better at sketching these apps out and using some of these tools. There's a free open SAP course on sketching. So there's a lot of ways to even build that skill up as well, if you're comfortable with that.
Great, thank you, Dan. The next question is, let me make sure I've got this right. What's the most important thing you did to become more involved in UX?
Yeah, so I think it was really just starting, that learning process. So certainly anyone on the webinar today, anyone that's come out to get more information on UX, you've jump-started that process, or maybe this is, something you're continuing to do along your learning journey. But, we talked about books, we talked about courses and conferences. A lot of these are free, or maybe your company will sponsor you to attend some of these things. But definitely keeping an eye on continuous learning is a big way. And then I think the second one is just find one tool or one thing you can do on your next project, whether it's creating a survey or a persona or doing some quick rounds of prototyping. Anything that helps you get practice and apply these learnings will really kind of amplify that learning experience. So continuous learning and starting small with whatever you think you can do on your next project.
Awesome. I think we have time for Yep, we have time for just one more question. As a developer, how do I make sure the SAP apps I create have a good experience?
Yeah. So I think that that's really a combination of a lot of the things that we've talked about today. I guess I would highlight two maybe specific areas. So first and foremost, talking to your users. So doing some of that user research to make sure that you know that not just what you think would be a good experience, but kind of from them, what are the challenges they have, and then you can start to think of ways to make improvements. So definitely that user research piece. And once you've done that, once you know what it is that you're looking to solve for, I think the Fiori design guidelines are the best place to go. As someone that's in SAP, as someone that will be probably building a lot of Fiori applications, that's the best place to go to understand what's the best way to put these apps together, what are the controls I should be using, and then ultimately too, like I said, what are some of the code samples or ways that I can actually get that implemented. So I think user research and taking advantage of the Fiori design guidelines will really help ensure that you have built not just an application, but a really good application that that the users will want to enjoy.
Fantastic. I think that's all we're going to have time for today. Thank you very much, Dan. As our time is just about up, for the folks that are that attended today, please reach out if you have any additional questions or if you're interested in receiving the recording of today's webinar. Also, if you're interested in scheduling some time to talk one-on-one with Dan regarding any projects you have in mind. Thanks again for joining us, and until next time.
Thank you, everybody.